Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first session of the first part of Beyond Bohm, Imagination, Creativity, and Dialogue. I'm James B. Barbieri, Associate Program Director here at the Burg Center, and I will be your host for today. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so any issues, technical or not, feel free to just let me know in the chat. Before we begin, let me just very briefly go through a few guidelines for these Zoom meetings. First, if you can please mute your microphones just to ensure good quality audio and avoid any background noise. But we would also like to invite you to turn on your cameras, as it's always nice to see familiar and new faces during these calls. The chat is going to be closed during the initial discussion, but we'll open up during Q&A. So feel free to share your ideas and thoughts during the Q&A. Finally, this session is recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recording should be available to you in a couple of days, and we'll send you the link once ready. Okay, so we can begin. So as I mentioned, this is the first part of this 6-week program entitled Beyond Bohm. We had our first installment last year, and thanks to Lee, we've redid it this year. So in this first part, will be composed of 3 weekends where we'll explore 3 aspects of Bohm's work and how it's been developed since its passing. This weekend, we will look at imagination, inquire into how David Bohm worked with imagination and participatory consciousness while improvising upon extending Bohm's approach. In the second weekend, we will discuss creativity and the artistic process by listening to artists who will explore themes such as wholeness and fragmentation and the artistic movement from implicate to explicate. Finally, on the third weekend, we will look at dialogue, which will open up many questions and concerns regarding the shift from the in-person dialogue to online, and some of the more general questions about the human digital technological interface. During this last weekend, we will also host the 2nd annual Indigenous Dialogue, facilitated by Leroy Littlebear. This year's theme of the dialogue will be Walk in Beauty, and will consider various approaches to ecology, environment, and the Anthropocene, the time of the new human. So today I'm honored to introduce the first panel, comprised of Nichol, Beth Macy, and Richard Burg. Nichol is the chair of this series, to which we owe a great thanks from everyone here at the Burg Center for organizing this incredible series. Lee is a freelance editor and writer. His latest works are Entering Bohm's Holoflux, and as editor Holoflux Codex, Form, Movement, Vision, inspired by David Bohm. He was a longtime friend and collaborator of David Bohm, and is the editor of Bohm's On Dialogue, The Essential David Bohm, and On Creativity. He has been on the faculty of the Arthur Morgan School in Cielo, North Carolina, the Oak Grove School in Ojai, California, the Tibetan Nyingma Institute of Berkeley, California, and the Denver University in Denver, Colorado. We also have Beth Macy, who has been a manager, consultant, and participants in organization ranging from small to large, public to private, nonprofit to for-profit, healthcare to oil and gas, global to local. David Bohm's dialogue has been at the core of her research, writing and consulting and teaching for the past 30 years. She's currently completing a book on the ideas and individuals who influenced Bohm's methodology of dialogue. Beth is also a contributor to the forthcoming book, Holoflux Codex, Form, Movement, Vision, inspired by David Bohm, from Perry Publishing. And finally, we have Richard Burg, who has been a potter, worked on internet technology and medical education research, and was for years an organizational consultant. His company, Simple Idea, worked with corporate leaders to integrate human values with the demands of productivity. When he encountered David Bohm's work in the 90s, he began organizing and participating in Bohmian dialogue groups in San Francisco Bay Area and Washington, D.C. More recently, due to COVID, he has been participating in online dialogue groups. Richard is also a contributor to the Holoflux Codex book, Form, Movement, Vision, inspired by David Bohm, which should be out in late 2022. Today, this panel will talk together on imagining imagination. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Lee.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Eleanor, and thank you everyone at the Burg Center for allowing us to continue with Beyond Bohm. And I think the title is very helpful because it reminds us that what we want to do with regard to David Bohm is not just study David and consider him and talk about him, but we want to in some way move on, take everything that he gave us that we find interesting, if we do, and put that to work and not just have it on the shelf. So it may be that not everyone has that interest, but in what we do in these programs, it's kind of that angle, kind of that perspective that we're taking. What does it mean to carry, you know, the different perspectives that David Bohm shared with the world? What does it mean to carry that forward? So that's really a big part of what we're trying to do, and particularly here today. But let me also emphasize what James said, that this is a 6-part series. And tomorrow we have a second imagination session with Tim Ingold, a remarkable scholar and anthropologist whose work is deeply, profoundly consistent with that of Bohm. And then the second weekend, we have 4 artists sharing their process and their work and themselves. And they'll be talking amongst themselves, showing their work and sharing with us how they do that work. And then the final weekend, we have 2 dialogue sessions, one dealing with Zoom, like we're doing now, what it's like to have moved into this world of Zoom and how it's different from not being in Zoom, but being face-to-face. And then the last weekend, we have Leroy Littlebear leading our second Indigenous dialogue. So it's really a rich program. I hope you can make it for as many of these as possible. So today we have imagining imagination. That's a big topic. So let me share a couple of things with you. There's this remarkable book. It's called The World of the Imagination. It's 850 pages. It's a monster of a book. And it's really remarkable. It's very powerful. It's very, it's not topical. It's really very in-depth, looking at the whole history of how people have thought about imagination. But that's not what we're doing today at all. We couldn't possibly begin to touch that. What we do today is try to get a feeling, a sensibility, such that we can, for what imagination might have meant to David Bohm. Now, that in itself is a huge undertaking, and we'll only do bits and pieces of that such that we can. But it's important to realize that we're not trying to define David Bohm and his imagination. We're not trying to come out at the end of this session with a fixed definition of what Bohm meant and what he might have done and what we might take from that. But we're going to experiment, we're going to probe, we're going to question, and see what happens in a spirit of free play as we look into certain aspects that are pretty clearly at least part of what David was sharing about the imagination. So that's our job today, and we'll get to that in a moment. But before we do, I just wanted to share a couple of things at a personal level, both having to do with the inspiration for doing this particular program at all. One part of that is that, to me, it's innately interesting and remarkable to try to look at what Bohm's imagination was and how he applied it and what we might be able to do as a result of looking into it. What can we glean from that? What can we extract from that and make it our own, not just emulate or copy or anything like that, but to give it life. But the second part that really moved me to get together with Richard and Beth and bring out this question of imagination is that I feel personally that we're in a pretty bad way right now. Humanity, it doesn't take a lot of looking around to see that we're painting ourselves into all kinds of corners. We're tying ourselves into all kinds of knots. And the world is a mess. And in keeping with Bohm, you know, he tried to ask why. Why do we keep doing this? Why do we have this recurring tying of ourselves in knots? Why do we have this recurring painting ourselves in corner? And to put a fine point on it, of fragmenting ourselves, of promoting violence, promoting hatred, killing. All of this is happening and it's all ratcheting up and it's very real. So I remember it was probably 2 years ago. It was after Paul Howard's film, Infinite Potential, that there were any number of presentations about Bohm on various topics. And in one of the panels after one of those films, after one of those discussion sessions, this very perky host, I can't remember her name, she asked Basil Hiley, well, Basil, since we're talking about everything being one world and we're all connected, what do you think David Bohm would think about the internet? And Basil dropped his head and said, I think he would be horrified. Now, why did Basil say that? And I have to say, from my perspective of knowing David, also, I think David would be horrified at what he's seeing is happening with the internet. Not the internet per se, but how the turns that it's taken and how it is manifesting. And most particularly, I think his view would be that all of the problems about thought and thinking and imagination that he was so concerned with, that all of those have been amplified in the way the internet is currently being used. And we know it's not conspiracy theory or speculation. We know that the underlying digital platforms are geared to make us fragmented. They're geared and designed to curdle our imaginations, to put our thinking into these mechanical, reflexive, somatic modes. The people that have created the algorithms tell us that. They acknowledge that. Many of those people don't let their own children use cell phones or computers except under incredibly highly monitored circumstances. So, you know, many people have many, many different views about this, and I don't want to go on and on. And I want to also be clear that here we are using the internet. I'm not trying to paint a black and white picture, but I do feel that we're potentially right at the edge of a crisis in terms of our collective capacity to be human beings together. And that the internet and the way it's currently operating is actually contributing to that far more than we tend to think it is. You don't have to look into it very deeply to realize what's behind all the patternings that we're all involved with every day. And it's all of us. It's not just the other guy. It's really all of us that I feel have to consider how all of this is working. And so because of that, this question of imagination to me is paramount. It's really critical to finding a way forward to not getting caught in the algorithms that are driving the digital platforms that we're all informed by every day. So that's kind of a personal take, and I'll move away from that now. Maybe we can discuss that later. We will be discussing that in our 5th session on July 23rd, with many points of view, not just mine. So if it interests you, please join in. So the kind of trigger, the catalyst for this whole session is a statement that David made 1976. What would that be? 40, is that 46 years ago? I think so. If my math is right, 46 years ago. He was in a conversation with the philosopher Renee Weber, and she alluded to the need for new models in physics. And David's response was, no, we don't necessarily need new models. What we need is new forms of imagination. And then he said, I consider the implicate order as a new form of imagination. So to me, this is a really, really riveting, pregnant statement that, you know, we could spend many, many, many sessions unpacking this. But we'll do what we can today. So if you'll be patient as I try to get my slides up here, and we'll get going. Okay, so with this, our foil today will be the sun and the solar system. So this is where we'll be working with a model and juxtaposing that with an imagination. And even though we'll juxtapose them, I don't think it's, again, it's not a black and white thing, that a model and an imagination are innately contrary to one another. One can contain the other, and the other can contain that one. It's a flexible, very dynamic process that could be involved. It need not be just a model or just imagination. They can interpenetrate. But to keep things fairly simple for today, we'll start with this model of the solar system, which we have here. And in a way, it's quite a good one. It's certainly better than the textbook images that I grew up with in the 1950s, the models of the solar system. This is a little more lively and interesting, but it is a model nonetheless. And for now, let's just say that it's likely that when Bohm spoke about models and said he was more interested in new imaginations rather than models, that a big part of what he meant was something that with a model, you can stand outside of it, right? That you can hold it, you can turn it around, whether it's physically or whether it's mentally. You're here and the model is there, and I can inspect it, and 50 other people can inspect it and look at it and comment on it. This would be a kind of simple starting way to think about a model. So then, if you just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, what we're going to do now is go through some aspects of what Bohm meant by imagination. And these are not exhaustive and they're overlapping, but they'll give us a good feeling for these different facets or aspects that Bohm probably meant when he was referring to new forms of imagination, that they would involve these things. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to get going here. There we go. So the first one, holism and organicism. So in this first round, we're going to go through these very quickly and just make a few comments. And then we're going to make a second move through them and talk about them in more detail. So if you just kind of make note, holism and organicism. The central feature here, among many others, would be that whatever's involved holistically and however you would say it, all of the aspects of whatever system this might be are internally related. They may also in some way be externally related, but they are internally in some subtle way all connected to one another. So both holism and organicism point to that. And with organicism, it's rarely acknowledged that Bohm's view, Bohm and Hiley's view, both of them together, was that the cosmos is organismic. Now, that's not to say it's absolutely an organism, but it's more like an organism than it is like a mechanism. So we use this term organicism. And this hints at this question of what if something's neither literal nor metaphorical, right? So when we talk about the cosmos as organismic, it's not quite literal and it's not quite metaphorical either. So the last thing about holism and organicism is all of the other attributes that we'll talk about that would be a kind of Bohmian universe of imagination. They're holistic and organismic. They all interpenetrate one another and inform one another. Okay, and another aspect would be movement, process, and flux. So these are kind of self-explanatory. I'm not going to dwell on them right now. We'll keep going through the list, but movement, process, flux, along with organicism and holism. And then let's see, I've got something extra. Okay. We have participation, indwelling, and habitation. Participation, indwelling, and habitation. We'll come in our second pass and talk in more detail about those. Another feature would be embodiment, feeling, and qualitativeness. Embodiment, feeling, and qualitativeness. And the next would be meaning and intelligence. Meaning and intelligence. And then we would have inquiry and evolvement. Now, this is not the same word, obviously, as evolution. It certainly shares a lot of features with evolution, but evolution, it has an almost automatic set of associations for us. So instead, we're using the word evolvement, meaning that in any kind of imagining process, It's always looking further and open to change and evolvement. So here we have them all together. We'll go through them once more. We have holism and organicism, movement, process, and flux, participation, indwelling, habitation, embodiment, feeling, qualitativeness, meaning and intelligence, inquiry, and evolvement. So I'm going to ask Beth, if she would, to take one of these aspects and share with us her experience and her feeling about what that could have meant for Bohm, how it might have worked for him, and perhaps even more importantly for our work here today, how that works for her, what it means in her life. So Beth, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, listening to that list and seeing it all in one place, I think almost everything Bohm stood for was right there. So it just, to start with, it just made me think how alive this whole broad umbrella of imagination is. But I'd like to say a little bit about the movement part. So that's a topic that's been on my mind for a long time. And so I've been trying to think about how it fits in with imagination per se. And I'd like to share first a story that Bohm himself tells. I think it sets a really great stage for jumping off on the topic of movement. So he tells us in various ways that when he was a kid, he was a pretty nervous kid, didn't feel real secure a lot of the time. And he tells us that he had developed for himself a strategy for how he would deal with situations where he didn't feel things were familiar, didn't know what was going to happen. So here's what he describes as his strategy. He said, I would just try to figure things out. So this is his figure things out strategy. And he said he wanted to control things for his intellect so that he felt more secure. Well, so here's the story. One time when he was with his friends, he's about 10 years old at the time, and he and his friends were hiking in the mountains, and they came to a river that they would have to cross. Well, this was a dilemma for for Bohm, because his figured out strategy wasn't going to work as he tries to hop across the stepping stones. He couldn't stop at every stone and say, now what do I do? How do I figure it out? So a dilemma. Well, what does he do? But here's his description. This is in his words. He says, the thing I remember was the stepping stones. I suddenly took a leap and it worked, you see. Suddenly, I had the insight that it wasn't necessary to figure it out, that the movement would look after itself. So, 10-year-old kid, and he's already figured out the importance of movement. So it wasn't the discrete stones to hop across, it was the flow across those stones. It was the process. It was the whole pattern, the whole flow that he figures out was movement. Now, go to his adulthood. If you've read any of his work, you run across the term holo movement right away. And this term movement, you can see where it started from, but he doesn't really like that word so much as he likes holoflux. Now, why was that? What was the difference? Well, he says when we talk about movement, we tend to think about something going from here to here. So we think of it as a process of translocation. It's not translocation he wants. It's transformation. So something is moving from a flow of highly subtle to highly discrete. So there's a flow that's going on there, and that fluxing that goes on in order to go from subtle to concrete is really what he's trying to talk about in this movement. So now he gives us a better example as it would apply to imagination much more directly. So let me share that with you. And again, keep in mind, he's trying to tell us about the transformation from subtle into concrete. So here's how he describes it. there's kind of this early phase, if we could call it a phase. He says imagination goes beyond what we already know. He says the mind is able to take hold of, to grasp something, even in its whole subtle state, and then to kind of transform it. And he said, by this, we produce things that were only potentialities before. So this first phase is fuzzy. We're grabbing something, but we don't even yet know what it is. It's something with lots of energy. We can't yet articulate it. But then as these phases or this flow continues, there's kind of a middle point. And what happens at that middle point is that our mind is real busy under the surface. It's looking for things we might already have in our intellectual libraries that could possibly fit with this inkling, this insight that we've had. And so eventually it starts to accrete, it starts to accumulate enough that we can start getting a grasp. We can start putting some language, some imagery to it, but still it's a bit fuzzy. But finally, our rational mind has become even more involved and translates it down. It's kind of like electricity getting transmuted from the big transformer down to the electrical socket in our house, which finally gets to the point where it's usable. At that point, the rational mind can actually grasp it and figure out a way to put it into some kind of experiment or some kind of an artist putting it on a canvas. In some way, it becomes very graspable. So again, this is like those stepping stones. We're hopping across. Now, there could be any number of parts to this pattern, phases to the pattern, but eventually what we're trying to do again is take something subtle to something quite discrete. And as Bohm would describe it, I like the way he says it. He says it, the universal then unfolds into the particular. And of course, then it's going to re-unfold back. So it's really not a linear movement. So that's about what I would have to say about movement. Lee, I'll go back to you.
Thank you, Beth. It's very interesting and I think important that on numerous occasions, Bohm is clear that his metaphysics, the entire platform for his metaphysics was movement. And it's so easy to think, well, is it that simple? Is it really just that? Is that really at the bottom of the whole thing? But when we start to consider, as you've begun to lay out, the real nuances and subtleties of what he meant by movement, I think it becomes a lot more apparent why he kept reiterating that through his whole life. So thank you for that. And Richard, I think you have one of these aspects that you're going to share with us.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about movement. Embodiment, excuse me. I was full of Beth's contribution. And this took me back in some way to identify what thinking about Bohm's work has meant and done for me in terms of actual body sensations and combined with how I think about what I'm feeling. And this reminded me, actually, Lee's image of the solar system, so out of scale, reminded me of seeing Saturn through a large telescope. I was a great fan of science fiction and had seen planetary models in the Hayden Planetarium in New York. But looking through this large telescope that the owner pointed to Saturn was an experience which I've never forgotten. I was probably 18 years old. And when I saw this, I saw Saturn, I saw the rings of Saturn, I saw the shadow of the rings of Saturn on the planet. I saw a refraction of light off of one of the rings. I mean, it was the most complex view of Saturn. And I was actually seeing it. It wasn't a drawing. It wasn't projected onto the ceiling of the Hayden Planetarium. And I had this very distinct feeling, clearly influenced by my science fiction, that if I saw that come, I would know that I was getting close to home. There was something about the image which signified where I came from. And that has kind of stayed with me all these years since. So I was introduced to Bohm's work by a friend who sent me a paper of a talk he'd given at MIT, and got very interested in his work. And there were many ways in which it influenced how I thought about the rest of my life, but it always came down to a feeling. And I think what happened to me when I saw Saturn was kind of an early version of some of the ways that thinking about Bohm's work generated a feeling in me. More recently, in the last decade or so, maybe 2 decades, I got interested in something called contact improvisation, a form of dance and movement done without music, where 2 bodies are in contact, moving around a central point of a central center of gravity. And it's often done, and I found it most pleasant doing it blindfolded. And what that generated in terms of what we're talking about, embodiment, was a kind of recognition that the body has a wisdom of its own. And when in contact with another body, they can be mutually supportive of movement around that common center of gravity. And for me, that reminds me of what Bohm was suggesting that we might feel if we could connect to what we're in, the implicate order. One of the ways I've thought about that is that we are in constant motion. The planet is spinning. The planet is moving around the sun. The solar system is moving in the galaxy, and the galaxy is moving in the universe. And yet, we're not dizzy or confused by all that movement. And yet, we are part of it. And I think what David was pointing to with the implicate order, and what we have to do to understand where he was pointing, is to recognize experiences connected to movement which aren't anchored in anything easily spoken of. And so dancing blindfolded without music in contact with others was a way to experience movement that was unpredictable and yet bound to the bodies that were in movement. Another way that I've thought about what David might have been suggesting about imagining, that when I was young, I would find myself looking at my hand sitting on the table and wonder what it was that allowed me to move each finger independently. I understood about the nervous system and impulse, but at some point, looking at my hand sitting on the tabletop, I could separate from it in some way and wonder about the connection between thinking about moving my hand and my hand actually moving. So it struck me in thinking about talking about this, that we're talking about going someplace with our imagination that isn't any distance at all from thinking about it. That is, we can't go there because we are there. And yet we don't necessarily have the tools to articulate exactly where that is if we open ourselves up to the possibility that everything is there with us. And so that's kind of a conundrum that is really rich in the very confusion it generates. And it's interesting that Lee said this, David wasn't suggesting either a metaphor or something literal. And yet, as I thought about it, metaphors and literality actually informed how I came to talk about it. Yeah, I think that's enough, Lee, for now.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Well, if we just took what the two of you have shared, we have plenty in store to look at together, but I do want to add one more of these aspects, which is the participation, indwelling, and habitation. Excuse me, I clear my throat here. Participation. I think anyone that spent even a little bit of time with David's work will have encountered this term multiple times. And one way to think about it is that in participating, we're involved in exchanging and giving and taking and reciprocal movements with whatever it is, whether it's a spider on the floor that I want to engage with, pick it up and put it out, whether it's a group of people that I'm in a dialogue with. Any way that we look at it, it's not me as isolated and the spider is isolated, but if I go to pick up the spider is going to move. If I'm in a dialogue group, everybody hopefully is contributing and partaking of and partaking in, as David said. So when we think about this with imagination, this participation, this indwelling, and especially this thing of habitation, if we think of the implicate order, we're in it. This is so crystal clear. Even at the earliest way of thinking about Bohm's implicate order, it's not a model that we stand outside of and look at and inspect. We can frame it like that, and probably there are times when it may be useful to do that. But more generally and more importantly, when we think of what he brought out with the implicate order, we have to call into question the entire framework of a subject-object worldview, where we're outside of a tree, where we're outside of the spider. I'm here, the spider is there. I'm here, the tree is there. I'm here, my family is over there. Right? All of this outside standing positioning, although it all has relative accuracy, in the imagination of the implicate order, right? Not the model of the implicate, but the imagination of the implicate order, we're in it. We're always in the world. We're always in everything. And, we can understand that in a certain way, and we can accommodate that conceptually. And then the next second we turn around and we find ourselves back in this very deeply ingrained positioning of being a separate observer. And again, that has some relative truth. But if we start to probe deeper and deeper into the nature of our experience, not just what Bohm said, but our experience, if we begin to sink further and further into our experience, it comes into question whether there's any such thing as standing outside of the world or standing outside of anything that we're in relation to. So we could, expand that to say we're in everything and everything's in us. And in a Bohmian view, that would be the view. That would be the valid, consistent view. But when it gets that big, we, I think, have a risk of falling into a kind of la-la. Oh, we're all one, everything is all together and we're all one. And then we turn around and we say and do hateful things. Right. So this is something that Bohm called attention to over and over and over again. And I think not just because he said it, but because it's true that we need to be alert to the kinds of contradictions that arise between concepts that we take on, like inhabiting totally a world or participating in the world, and then how we actually behave. And it may be, if we're willing to stay with those contradictions, then we could begin to unravel them somewhat, right? So this whole question of habitation is a place where these kind of contradictions show up. And one of the questions for us, which we can ask now, is, can we learn more about this participatory perspective, about this being an inhabitant, that is habitation, of indwelling, of being within our realm of experience rather than standing outside of it? Can we begin to learn more about how all of that's working and have some relationship to that that's not just a fancy concept of unity, oneness, which are good concepts, but then how often do they break down for us? And how easy it is to say it's the other guy that does that. It's the other guy that's fragmented. It's the other guy that's full of preconceptions and so on, rather than realizing, there again it is, that we're also participating, indwelling in all of this fragmentation, in all of these contradictions that are moving through the world. So it moves in many directions when we think about participation and habitation and indwelling, these qualities of being somehow other than objectively standing aside from the things in our life. So this is a central piece of really any kind of diorama that Bohm created in his imagination, is that we're in it. We can act like we're not in it, but we do dwell in the totality of the world. And if we're going to make models from that kind of imagination, we're much better served to make a model that includes me as the observer in whatever it is I'm engaged with, rather than assuming this objectivist position. So that's what I'll pitch into the mix. Now, what we haven't addressed between the three of us is holism and organicism, meaning and intelligence, inquiry and evolvement. Those aspects we haven't yet touched on. So what I'd like to do, Richard and Beth, if we could continue the three of us together, and then after a bit, we'll bring the audience in. What can we say, at least a little bit for now, about these aspects that we haven't touched on? participation, well, that we did. Meaning and intelligence, holism and organicism, inquiry and evolvement. Do you have any initial thoughts, either of you, that could get us started?
Well, I think when you spoke about holism, I think you mentioned the word, or I wrote down the word coherence. And it strikes me that the issue of coherence and internal consistency, a kind of alignment of elements, also applies to meaning and inquiry. That the way in which we hold our question about this, a question about a new form of imagination, which David may have been pointing to, we have to be open to a surprise, and yet it has to be coherent with everything we bring to that inquiry. And I don't think it separates out just to holism. In fact, looking at this list, each divided into almost 3 separate elements, it's almost each one of them could be discussed separately. That indwelling and habitation, while related to participation, we could have a session on one of them alone and look at the boundaries as permeable rather than rigid for any of these separate labels that we've chosen for these 6 aspects you've called out.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. It really is like the Cliff's Note title for Bohm work. You know, it's real. It encompasses so much, and there's so many related. But I wanted to say something about meaning, and then I have a question about meaning. I kind of got myself stuck, so I was trying to think about this. So one of the things Bohm says about meaning is you can't define it, and yet it's so essential. So it's like a conundrum. We can't define something that's so incredibly essential. But what he says is it has to be unfolded. That it has to go through this process of making it concrete enough that we can start to deal with it, but then we can flow it back with new meaning attached to it. So, but it seems to me that one of his descriptions when he writes about it is that meaning is the what is. Meaning and movement together are the what is, the essential realities of everything, that they're that core. So I find that really interesting, that is kind of like the basic of everything that we're talking about here. But the question that I have then about this, Lee, is it seems like imagination is the unfolding process of meaning. Because something can be holistic and meaningful, but we can't grasp it until we've indulged in this imagination and tried to bring it down, at least to the point where we can touch into it and we can put the somatics on it, as Richard said. But am I taking this too far when I say what is being unfolded, or in the contradictions that you suggested that we hold? It seems like it's in the holding of those contradictions that the meaning is allowed to evolve a bit or become more concrete. So am I taking the idea of meaning too far there?
I don't think so personally. I think what you brought out is critical to what we're trying to do here today. And of course, it recalls the phrase unfolding meaning. And so you've put the word imagination to that. And I'd never seen it like that before. But the moment you say it, it seems patently obvious that the world, as Bohm seemed to have looked at it, is rife and packed with meaning, endless combinations and permutations of meaning. And that for us as individuals or as a collective, to unfold that meaning, which isn't always apparent, right? It's often somehow folded into our experience, but then to draw that out and unfold it, it seems to me that that precisely is what he was trying to do with imagination. So it's leaving me kind of breathless that you made that so clear and so simple.
Well, can I put a PS on that too?
Please.
It seems to me that he also was saying this isn't a one-way circle. This isn't half a circle. This isn't just an arc. That we also participate in the development of meaning by the way we deal with it here, because we re-unfold it, and that helps send new potential meaning back to the universe as well. So it seems to me it's really a spiral, not just a one-way event, that we have an important role to play in how we try to grapple with imagination by adding to it.
Yeah, it's recursive. It re-enters itself. It's not, it doesn't stand alone or come to termination, because it is, I don't know that it's cyclic, but it continues.
Right. So I think you both brought out something of critical importance, that meaning isn't in the world, the cosmos, the universe, just as something that we apprehend as human beings. We often think of meaning as something exclusive to us, as something that human beings, or possibly mammals, so-called higher orders of life, have developed this sense of meaning. But in a Bohmian imagination, the entire cosmos is shot through with meaning. And that meaning is there before human beings came along. And in the event that we pass away from the cosmos, that circulatory meaning, as you've both pointed out, this reciprocal recurrent meaning, it will still be part and parcel of the nature of the cosmos, of the implicate and explicate orders, of the holo movement. So I think this is a really valuable thing to try to get our head around, is what does it mean to live in a cosmos where meaning is not exclusive to human beings? Just very central.
Yeah, I think taking exceptions to something you said, in the eventuality, we eventually no longer exist. If you think hard about the timescale of the universe, or even the timescale of the evolution of life on this planet, it seems highly probable, in fact, almost guaranteed, that there will be a time when we're not here, because there was a time when we weren't here. And whether we deal directly with the present crises or not, over 1 million years, it seems pretty clear there will be something else. I don't know what it is, but it will be different.
Yes, quite right, quite so. So let's see, a couple of these other aspects that we haven't taken up yet. I'm just going to pluck inquiry and evolvement out of the hat there as a central aspect of, if one were to try to engage imagination as Bohm did, then inquiry and evolvement would be central to that. In that, there would be no stopping point. There would be no point at which, okay, we now have the model, with emphasis on model. We now have the picture that we're after. We now have the understanding that we were after. We now got something that's good enough. In a Bohmian imagination, that would never happen. There would be a perpetual state of inquiry, of continually asking, of looking, of staying alert, both somatically in an embodied way and cognitively, completely sensitive, completely awake as much as humanly possible, and constantly inquiring. And because of that constant, perpetual inquiring, which we're trying to do a little bit now, such that we can, that's where the evolvement comes in. Not necessarily evolution with the sense of, that there's evolution of the species and a Darwinian view. I wouldn't exclude that, but this sense of evolvement is a little different from that, in that it simply means perpetual change. Perpetually changing. Better, worse? Those kinds of questions I think really would not come in if we're in a constant inquiring condition, that what we find is change and combinations and permutations that weren't there the moment before. So among these various attributes, this is one that, for me at least, is right at the top of the list in terms of personal challenge, because I like answers, right? I like solutions. I like to have a package that I can kind of feel I know how things are working. And up to a point, that seems really viable and helpful and useful. But it's when we begin to become human beings that operate only with that, with our answers, with our conclusions, with our images, with our models, something begins to die then, and we start to become fearful, protective, fragmented, right? All these things kind of entrain one another. So this perpetual inquiry and this sense of endless evolvement, and that word, I think, it means turning, evolvement. The root is volere or volvere. This goes back to what you were both just saying about meaning being a circuit, meaning being perpetual. So part of this evolvement has to do with this meaning. So that's another piece that I would bring in here. So I'm checking the time. Yes, Richard.
That way of looking at meaning, it's a cliche, but it reminded me of the statement that you never step into the same river.
Twice.
Right.
No, like you say, it's a cliche. And yet, if we look behind the cliche, what would it mean to really engage with the world and have our sensitivity so open that we experience the world even a little bit like what you just said?
Right.
It's much easier said than done, but maybe not out of the question for us. So, I'm sorry, Richard?
It's a practice.
Yes, quite so. So before we go to our next segment, maybe we could take a couple of comments or thoughts or questions from anybody that's willing to step forward. A couple of comments and see where those take us. James, do we have anybody that?
Yes, if you would like to ask your question or contribution, if you can use the raise your hand function, which can be found under reactions at the bottom of your screen. And also, we just like to remind you to sort of be respectful of everyone else who would like to ask a question. So if please keep your contributions and questions So a bit more brief and to the point. I can see we have some hands up already. We'll start from Asia.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sorry, audio challenges. Thank you so much. There was just one thing I was contemplating that's sort of obvious, but also always interesting for me in thinking about imagination and participation. And that's the element of just recognizing that even when we are in kind of the default mode of imagining ourselves to be separate from the world, the environment, everything, other people, that still is this act of imagination and participation and kind of reinfolding that pattern into our experience. And I think maybe it's interesting for me to contemplate that because of how much that my tendency is to feel like, oh, that's just what's happening. That's just the default, the sense of separateness, the sense of, the mountain over there is separate from me. But then realizing that that's also an act of imagination that's just happening without much awareness or inquiry going into it. So then I think bringing in that inquiry and that kind of active awareness of imagination brings a very different quality. But to just see that, even that kind of default mode is an imaginative act. It's just that it's totally habitual and lacks kind of the awareness of imagination is something I find very interesting to contemplate in this whole conversation of how we are participating even when we don't are not aware of it, but then how much more rich that can be when we bring awareness and inquiry to the process of participation.
Thank you, Asia. Richard or Beth, would you care to comment?
Wow. The question comes to my mind, Asia. Is there really anything other than imagination? Because what you're suggesting to me is we can be in imagination and aware, or in imagination and not aware. But maybe we're always one way or another in imagination. Is there anything other than imagination?
Well, I think in Asia's example, there is a way looking at the mountain where if you deepen your experience, you actually feel something different, whether it's scale that triggers a feeling, or scale of the mountain, or the question of distance, or even the way you process the image of the mountain. When it becomes a feeling, you've changed your relationship to the mountain in some way that may be at the threshold of Bohm's use of imagination around the implicate order.
Thank you, Beth and Richard. One other point I would bring in, Asia, so much of what Bohm's work was about had to do with the self-image and the ego, whatever we want to call it. So I'm just going to torque your point a little bit in that direction. And, when we see that there are issues there, that self-image and the ego can be problematic, that can get fixed and locked in too. And seeing it as problematic can become problematic. But there's another way to look at these things. And one way that it appears to me, and this is analogous to what you're talking about, is the appearance of the self-image is an astonishing feature of the universe. It is absolutely astonishing that capacity has come about in the corner of the universe that we call human beings. And if we can see it with that sense of wonderment, it might make it enormously more easy to engage with how that whole process works. And so the same thing, I think, about what you're saying about being in a subject-object mode with the world, that default mode. To have that mode as part of our constitution, it's a kind of miracle. It's a kind of astonishing capacity. And yet it's taken us over. You know, we've gotten frozen into that. So part of what I see the beauty of what you're proposing is that we can see these things that are often tacitly framed as problems and difficulties. Excuse me. We can begin to look at them differently and see them as displays and really astonishing ways in which our consciousness works. And to come full circle with your point, that all of that is imagining too, all of it. So many thanks for bringing that point out. Another question, another comment.
Thank you, Aja. Next, we'll go to Rob. Oh, Rob.
Sorry, I was just muted there. Yeah, so if you take imagination as being everything, you know, and how we're creating our reality literally, it kind of reminds me of this this quote that was in Robin Kimmerer's book, The Braiding Sweetgrass. She was talking about the Wendigo energy and how it's in each one of us, and it's she just said it goes, you know, see the dark, recognize its power, but do not feed it. And that ties back into what you guys are saying about recursiveness of meaning. And so it seems, you know, I don't know, like what's happening mostly in the affairs of man right now is that this recursive process, you know, isn't opening out at all. Actually, it's folding back in on itself repeatedly, and it isn't moving. And to me, you know, that's kind of a way of expressing this meaning of Wendigo. She was talking about it in terms of greed, mostly, but I think that, you know, if there's some way of activating a faculty within us where we can actually see or feel this process of recursiveness, of repetitiveness happening in real time as we're engaging with the world and each other, and how we're constantly remaking things in the same way. And in fact, things aren't unfolding at all. Of course, you know, I mean, it's probably patently obvious to everybody here. But so I guess I'm just trying to introduce this notion of, you know, having a faculty that can see this happening in real time, this recursive or this turning inward in the same repeating pattern. And there's multiple ways that that happens. And unless we can actually do that for ourselves as we're living our lives, it seems to me that, you know, there's a tremendous hopelessness about that, because there's no awareness of what's going on as it's occurring. It's not some abstract intellectual exercise, you know. It has to be real time. And so, you know, therein lies the faculty of awareness, and how do you awaken it? Real-time awareness, not considering an abstraction, which we're, of course, extremely adept at, and we fall into it, you know, all the time, very easily. So that's kind of, it's meandering, I'm sorry, but that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Rob. I think you've really put your finger on the heart of the matter, which is, how do we engage with any of these things in real time, in their actual manifesting, rather than after the fact or before the fact or in some kind of abstraction? But how do we meet these things in their livingness? So I don't know, Beth or Richard, if you have any further thoughts on that.
I
No,
just have started
really.
reading that book, so I can't respond much to it other than to say I'm intrigued by it. And I'm just curiously if maybe this would be something that we could ask Leroy and the Indigenous group on the last session. If we could kind of hold on to this and bring it forward to ask them how they would suggest it. I know that the author of Ready Sweet Grass will be with us that time. This is really a deep question. I think that we ought to not lose. I don't know what to say to it.
I just wanted to say that the notion of recursion is not a tight loop of repetition, but applying the skills of inquiry to a new circumstance. So because things are flowing and changing all the time, to label something recursive means to respond to it as it is in the moment, rather than recreate and reiterate what triggered the response. So while what's happening may be what Rob described, it's not really recursion.
Okay, well, you know what, you understand what I'm saying though, right?
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
though I used the wrong word, I'm sorry, but
No, that's all right.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, for coming in. Next, there's actually two questions in the chat, which I believe will be useful regarding sort of definitions and the words we've been using so far. The first one is whether mind and imagination are the same in Bohm's thinking. And the other one is regarding how Bohm saw the universe, the difference between organism and organismic. This person believes that Bohm said that universe is not an organism. So if these two could be clarified.
Could you repeat the first one again, James?
Yes, the first one is mind and imagination, if
Okay.
they're the same.
Right. So just very briefly on both of those, I think for Bohm, mind is a much larger category on the surface of it than imagination. Now, if we take what Beth and Asia were talking about, we could consider imagination to be equivalent to mind in Bohm, and that would be, I think, a very fruitful inquiry. But before going down that road, I think the safest place to begin would be to say that for Bohm, mind is a larger, more comprehensive, extensive category than imagination. But I wouldn't hold that as fixed. I would just hold that as a starting point. And the second point about organism and
organismic in regards to the universe.
right. So I think we can quite safely say that Bohm and Hiley take the position that the universe is organismic. And that's because it's holistic and all the parts are related to one another in an inner way rather than just like in a billiard ball external fashion, but there's an internal relation. And so, excuse me, from that perspective that Bohm and Hiley quite clearly take, the universe is much more organismic than it is mechanistic. And the difference between organism and organismic is something that I've tried to tease out for quite a long time. There are a dozen or 50 different ways of looking at that question. And, you know, we don't have time to open that out today. But I think it's an extremely important question. And that if you inquire into that, even if you never come to a conclusion or an answer, just the inquiry itself, what is the difference between organism and organismic? Just the inquiry will yield enormous insights and bear all kinds of fruit. So, right. Now, let me mention, James, before we continue, we're running into a time factor. So let's take one more question or something from the chat, or one more comment, and then we need to get back into our rhythm. And I should mention that because of that time factor, we won't be taking a break. So if you need the body break, then just take it as you need to, and we'll carry right on through. So one more comment.
From the chat or from Hans? Lee, would you like a comment from the chat or a comment from the audience?
Yes, why not take something from the chat?
So I can see there's a question from Henry, who asks, how do you see Bohm's imagination relating to Henry Corbin's Mundus Imaginalis?
Beth or Richard?
Not familiar with Henry Corbin's Mundus Imaginalis.
I think it's you, Lee.
I would love to do an entire series, not just a session, but an entire series on Bohm's notion of imagination and Henry Corbin's notion of the imaginal. So I think the distinction that we would want to make right out of the gate on that, and it's a distinction, right? If we pursued it at length, we might find the distinction getting thinner and thinner. But as I understand what Bohm was bringing forth about imagination, it involves the things that we're talking about today overtly. You know, all the things in our list, they interpenetrate one another, and they're all traceable very clearly to what Bohm said. With the imaginal world, as Henry Corbin spoke of it, there's an element there that's not in Bohm. And if it is in Bohm, it's certainly well hidden. And that element is that there is a domain between the physical world and the consciousness of human beings and the imagination of human beings, in which other consciousnesses operate. And those consciousnesses can manifest in subtle forms as beings. So this imaginal realm that Corbin talks about involves, in almost all cases, some kind of engagement with what we would call suprasensory beings that can appear to human beings. One obvious example would be angels. So in Corbin, angelology it's at the core of Corbin's imaginal world, but not limited to angels. There are other aspects and other beings in this imaginal domain in Corbin beyond just angels. But the main point is that in Corbin, the presence of these beings and engagement and participation with them is the point of the work that a person does from a spiritual perspective. That doesn't exist in Bohm, at least not in any overt way. So I think that would be the starting point of a conversation about that question. Most definitely not the end point, but the starting point of how to talk about the imagination in Bohm and the imaginal in Corbin. Okay, one more comment, James, and then we'll continue.
I think we've got Anna Factor would like to ask a question and make a contribution.
Hi, Anna.
Yes, I'm unmuted. I was intrigued with and reminded of things in the conversation about meaning and imagination. I was driving once with my husband, who was very ill, and we were going for a doctor's to a clinic, and I felt a need for strength, which I realized in the rocks and mountains around me. I could do with that strength. And now, listening to this, that sounds like an act of imagination, but it gave me strength, and I still remember it. But I remember in our dialogues, one of the questions often was about being. That reminds me that David used to draw diagrams to illustrate what he was trying to explain to us. And one of them was meaning and being. And there was a third point, which I can't remember. My notes are not with me. Do any of you remember? Anyhow, meaning and being affected each other. And I remember him saying, a change of meaning is a change of being, which is what we used to look back to in our dialogues over the months. People would want to talk about being, inquire into what that meant.
Beth, Richard, thank you, Anna.
And I did just a little bit of looking into meaning. That's what, that he came close to equating them. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm not going from experience with him like Anna and Lee, like you are, but I think he was describing that the issue of meaning was so core and central that it couldn't be disengaged. So if you dealt with one, you also dealt with.
Sorry, Beth, we can't hear you very well. Yeah.
The sound seems to be coming in and out.
Can you get closer to your microphone?
I can't. I'm sorry. It's stopping right now. My computer's having problems. So go ahead.
No, it's good now.
Oh, no, I'm just saying that he brought those two so closely together that I haven't been able to see how you disengage them. And I would be really interested to hear about that, but that they are both so very core that when you shift something of deep meaning to you, you've also shifted your essence. That it helps to reconfigure what we are when we change our understandings.
All I would add to that is I have to admit to leaving a dialogue and feeling a shift, and whether that is related to a change in meaning being a change in being, I think remains to be discovered. But looking at meaning in the context of Bohm's experiment to experience thought in the collective definitely altered the way I saw the world when I left that space.
And I would go back, Anna, to what you said in the beginning, which still is sitting with me and moving me in ways that I can't really articulate very well, but I'll take a stab at it. And that is that when you were driving your husband, Don, he was ill, and you were in the mountains, and you took strength from the mountains. To me, this is an extraordinary movement of imagination, right? And gets us much deeper and closer to what David was trying to get us to consider, that imagination is not just a question of being able to think things up and write a novel. It certainly can be that, but we typically think of imagination in terms of just making new images and being able to spin maybe a fanciful universe or something like that. But I think he was really pointing to the very kind of thing that you describe of, and this is where participation comes in, that through your imagination, you were engaging and participating with those mountains and those stones, and that something crossed and passed between you. This is that reciprocal movement. And that, in my opinion, from a Bohmian perspective, this would be something far more than just fantasy, which is what imagination is often reduced to, is fantasy. But I really think that David was pointing us toward the kinds of engagement with the living world, which includes mountains, that you described to us so directly and poignantly. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think in order to get through what we have left, we need to continue. And I'm going to make an attempt to get back to our slides. Let's see, I'm going to share a screen here. And okay, I've got the wrong thing. Okay, this is where we left off. If my wife Eva wasn't here right beside me, I'd be in a mess with these slides. But she is here, so let's see. Okay, I'd like to get a little bit personal here. And it seems contradictory with what we're talking about to bring up the personal. But just like what Anna just shared about her and Don and the mountain, that's completely personal. And when we try to open up this question of imagination, I think we really have to do that, because that's where it lives. It's not an abstract concept. Imagination, in the way that I understood Bohm to engage it, is incredibly personal in the sense that it's where we live. It's the substance of our life and the things that matter and the things that have meaning. And it's in that domain that we engage with imagination. So what I'll share with you today in this next sequence is very personal in that respect. I'm in no way expecting anyone to accept it, to believe it, but to consider that this is one way of engaging a quality of imagination in the way that Bohm seemed to be talking about it. So we're back to our model, right? This is the model of the solar system. And a good model in a certain way. As Richard said, it's certainly not to scale, but it probably achieves its purposes in certain respects. But I'd like to share a personal imagination of this same phenomenon that we're looking at here. And to begin this, I just want to share some images from a stunning book. I'll show you another book. It's another big book, but it's big in a different way. It's a huge, amazing book of art and intelligence and imagination by the Dutch-German author Andreas Salarius. He lived in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And he has this huge array of images in this book about the solar system. And of course, some of them may be a bit outdated by now, but what we really want to look at here is the participatory quality. in modeling, quote unquote, modeling the solar system, what we want to consider, and the bigger your screen, the better for this. If you have the option to go to a big screen, please do. So this is his planispherium. And what we see, among many other things, in the borders, in the borders, this is often considered just to be decoration. But what I want to say is that there's tremendous meaning in here. For instance, in the bottom left-hand corner, you have generations of people, very young to medium young to older to elderly, all in a sequence with different instruments, learning about the cosmos, right? This is not, in my view, just decoration. This is intended to convey meaning to the people who would open this book up and look at it, so that there's much more here than in the modern version, the modern image of the solar system, and it's more than just decoration. And you have on the same thing on the right-hand corner, you have astrolabes, you have huge globes, you have people of many different ages. Of course, they're all male, I think, in these images. That was the time. But you have these amazing kinds of telescopes that they're looking through. So you have all of this, and then this deeply artistic sensibility of the relationships of the planets and the sun and the moon. To me, this is a spirit of Bohmian imagination that's neither literal nor metaphorical. It's in that in-between place. And this entire book of Andreas Salarius is filled with these kinds of images that have this deeply participatory quality that's intended to draw you into it, not just something to be looked at. So we'll go again for comparison. Okay, so onward with Andreas Salarius. This is an image of that compares different stars and planets in their relative sizes. And of course, if we were to gauge this by modern standards, most of it would be inaccurate, and maybe even all of it would be inaccurate. But that's not the point at all. The point is the feeling quality. We're back to another one of these components of Bohmian imagination, for lack of a better term. It's almost as if these different luminous spheres are beings, right? There's a sense of life in them. And I'm left feeling, what is this? What could this be? Help me to know more about this. And I'm pulled and kind of gravitationally pulled into what's being conveyed. And then again, in the borders, we have all the cherubs. And it's a funny word if we want to talk about Corbin, Henry Corbin, and angelic beings. Cherubs were not these necessarily cheerful, infant-like little beings. They were extremely powerful and even dangerous beings. But in any event, the way they're used here is more than just decoration. There's a sense of participatory movement. There we are again with the movement and life here. And similarly in this one, with the Earth at the center, these clouds that are surrounding the Earth, and then the phases of the moon surrounding the cloud that's surrounding the Earth. There's this sense of something alive in the middle of it, and it's not depicted as something that one just looks at. You know, this is what, 500 years ago, more or less, and what is happening is an attempt to engage the viewer in and out into this same looping circuitry of participation in what's being presented, rather than just something to be looked at for information. So I'm embarrassed now. We've come to this slide of Van Gogh, and I've forgotten the name of it. If anyone can put the name in the chat, that would be great. But what I'm trying to convey is a comparison between these two images of Van Gogh and this one of Salarius. So with this one of Salarius, we see and can feel, if we're willing to enter the image, we have the sun itself coming all the way out to me as the viewer, as far as the page will allow it. Now, this is what's called, of course, perspective. And perspective comes in for a hard time, and for good reason. Perspective has created a number of very curious issues that in one of our sessions, Sky Horna will bring out some of these concerns about the underlying activity of perspective in the photographic gaze. But in this case, I'm proposing that it's extremely creative, and that the sun is not just an object over there, but Salarius is trying to convey that the sun is here. It's both here and there together. And that's one of the underlying intentions of this particular image. And so when we go to Van Gogh, there are many things of great interest happening here. One of them is that the sun is not just an object, but the rays of the sun are falling across and through and into the field and right into the viewer, right up to wherever you are as the viewer. It's contiguous. The sun is not over there and you're over here. The sun is coming all the way up to you. And I've just been given a note. The name of this is Enclosed Field with Rising Sun. Thank you, Eva. But there's more. Not only is it doing what the Salarius is doing by making the sun contiguous, and the sun is not over there, the sun is here, right? But also there's this lateral movement in the sun, if you see going left and right, that the normal depiction of the sun as either rays or these circular emanations coming out, they begin to disperse. And it's not just the blue sky that's there on the left and right. What we have is more sun continuing to the left, to the right, and if there were more above, it would be continuing above. And what I want to suggest about that is that Van Gogh may have had some imaginative apprehension of what we now call the heliosphere, which is an emanation of the sun. It's a movement of the solar wind. It's much vaster and bigger than what we normally think of as the sun. So in this image, we have the sun coming into us, into the field, and through the field into us. And then we have this much vaster sense of the sun as a bigger movement and process than we normally consider. So this is just the two of those together, where we can clearly see, at least in my imagining of it, and again, this is personal, how I'm sensing this, that in both of these images, there's an understanding that the sun is not an object, that the sun is here in me, that the sun is brought into me as a viewer through the intentions of both artists here. And that this is a kind of imagination in the way that Bohm would think. Okay, so there's that one again. Right, so thank you, Eva. She's really helped me to extract some of these features of Van Gogh's painting so we can look at them a little more carefully. And here, it's what I'm going to call imaginatively the heliosphere, right? Rather than just the disk of the sun, and rather than just the typical emanation, the circular emanation of the sun, we have a further emanation of the sun moving somewhat like wind would. But of course, in Van Gogh's time, I think the notion of solar wind was not especially prominent. Could have been, but I don't think so. But there seems to me to be some kind of very deep, implicate, intuitive understanding of the almost unspeakable expansiveness of the sun. So what we've done is taken the liberty of going to another Van Gogh, which is A Starry Night. And we've taken some of those stars from A Starry Night, and we've placed them within the kind of typical placement that you might find the planets in the solar system. So what's at work here? What are we trying to do with this image? This is where the organismic question comes in, and I'm just proposing for fun. This is a kind of imaginary play. I'm proposing that the planets, as we think of them, are actually inside the sun. That the planets are inside the sun. So if we consider the solar wind and the heliosphere to be the sun rather than just the disk, then this is clearly not just an imaginary scenario. It really is the way that things are. But it's so normal and so easy to walk outside and innately feel we're here on the earth and the sun is there. But this imagination in an organismic sense, in a Bohmian organismic sense, would be that the sun contains the planets. The planets are within the sun. It's one organismic movement. That's the proposal I'm asking you just to entertain. Okay, so I'm trying to get to the next slide here. Right, so with this one, we're extracting one of these and saying, this one is the earth. It's just our way of playing with it, with Van Gogh as our substance. So when we consider that, my own feeling about this, and it's an imagination that I've been experimenting with for about 4 years now. And what happens, strange as it may seem, is I really do begin to experience Earth as being a cell within the sun. Not as a planet in that model of the solar system, but that Earth herself is a cell within the sun. So then if we take that one step further, each of us, in this way of imagining, is a cell within Earth, and Earth being a cell within the sun. So what happens when you get these kind of experiments in motion, these kinds of imaginations. And this is related to what I think Rob was saying about do it in real time, not just as an idea, but test it, see what happens when you test it. A lot of things begin to change and get very strange and beautiful and wonderful. And sometimes it can be unnerving, but that's okay to learn and change. Again, that's the evolvement aspect. It may be necessary sometimes to have some discomfort, some vertigo, some uncertainty. But in any event, back to this image, this is for me, and I'm not trying to say it was necessarily, if David was here, if he would concur with this, I don't know. But for me, and working with what I understand from Bohm, this is how I've come to experience myself as a human being, as a cell within Earth, and that Earth is a cell within the sun, and therefore I too am a cell within the sun. So let me continue here. Right, so here you just get a sense of how that works out in a kind of linear progression. And let's see, what else do we want to do with this? Right, so again, just remembering that outside the circular emanation of the sun is this, what I'm imagining to be the heliosphere. So you can go vastly away from the sphere, what we think of as the sphere of the sun, and yet that's still the sun, and we're in that. We're in that right now. Even if it's dark where you are, we're still within the sphere, the real emanation of the sun. Okay. So here's the image again, just to give that feeling of the sun coming to us and not being at a distance. And so you can kind of transpose what we were just talking about of us being cells within the sun. And every time I look at this, it sends shivers up my spine, because the feeling I get, it's the feeling I get. I don't know about anybody else, but it's like he has taken the sun into himself and he knows it. And he is the sun. He is radiating the sun. Okay, the last bit in this sequence, I just like to, here's our full array of the organismic sun, in which we're cells within the sun. And I'd like to lay beside that this question that Rupert Sheldrake has posed, which is an extraordinary question. It's just bottomless and marvelous. And the question is the sun conscious? Is the sun conscious? So he's written a paper about that, and it doesn't take the perspective that we're taking here with the Van Gogh, although there is certainly some overlap. But the question itself is sufficient to expand somewhat this Van Gogh imagination that I found a great deal of value in inhabiting, of indwelling, of participating with. Okay, so just a couple of more things in a different sequence. You'll see that it's related momentarily. There was an old friend of David Bohm's. His name was Joseph Chilton Pierce. Some of you may know of Joe's work. And in the last book that he did, called the Mind-Brain Connection, its original title was Strange Loops, and then a different publisher took it and changed the name to the Mind-Heart Connection. But Joe had this imagination, and I'd like to share that imagination with you. First, he took this image, which is a real image from a laboratory at the University of Utah, an imaging laboratory. And what this shows is the electromagnetic torus movement from the human heart, right? This is not made up. This is it's of course computer generated, but it's generated from the actual electromagnetic movements emanating from a real human being's heart. There are a number of these images from this laboratory. And then Joe remembered this image of the electromagnetic fields of the earth. Thought, wow, they're awfully similar. And so he would juxtapose them. Sorry, I went to the wrong one. I keep going the wrong way. Oh dear, how am I going to get back row? There we go, sorry. Okay, so we start with the human heart, electromagnetic rays. Then we come, this is a NASA image, by the way. This is, again, not just made up out of whole cloth. It's a computer generated image from NASA, from a satellite, of the Earth's electromagnetic field. And so Joe then thought, well, what about the sun? And this is the sun, of course, blanked out so it doesn't burn up the camera. But this is another NASA image of the electromagnetic field of the sun. So when you look at all these together, for Joe Pierce, in his envisioning of this, what he felt was important was to bring our individual electromagnetic fields into some kind of coherence with that of the earth, and then in turn with that of the sun. Now, what would it mean to do that? My goodness, I'm not real sure what it would mean to do that. But along with Rupert Sheldrake's question, is the sun conscious? I think it's a deeply important exploration that any of us can engage with, working with these models to supplement our imagination, to reconsider who we are and what our place in the universe actually is. Okay, let's see what we have next. Okay, I'm going back. And I think we'll take, let's see here. I think we'll just take one or two comments because we really are getting short on time. I apologize to everyone. But just one or two comments on the Van Gogh sequence and the Joe Pierce sequence. James?
Yeah, so as before, if you can use the raise your hand function, but already see Pam has her hand up.
Pam?
Hi.
Hi. Can't hear you.
Again.
Pam, you're muted. You need to unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
So thank you. I don't know how to thank you because I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. I don't know where to begin really, but something about being has been very important for me when reading David Bohm and my own search for what it might mean. And you just said something wonderfully. I was really almost moved to tears about it because you talked about cells And a long time ago, I came to the conclusion that we might be likened to cells on the earth, as we have cells in our body. And not only could we be cells, we might be good cells or bad cells as well. So we could be a virus. But in my work as a painter, I have done bodies of work which have tried to show our intrinsic connection with not only Earth, but with the planets as part of the greater universe. Absolutely convinced that you cannot separate anything at all. So everything that all of you have said has been so meaningful to me that I have so many things I want to say, but I think I'll just stop there. Except there is one thing that I would like to ask you perhaps to address very quickly, and that is the notion of consciousness. Is it possible that Bohm's implicate order contains consciousness, and we can in some way extract it as we begin to apprehend things in a certain way? I can't really ask anymore. You're going to run out of time, but I'd love to hear you have something to say on that, perhaps. And thank you so much again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Pam. Just a couple of quick things. One, I assume, Eleanor, that we will have a sutra circle for this group,
Yes.
which is a message board, and Eleanor has just confirmed that we will. So Pam, I would encourage you, if you're willing, once that sutra circle is up and running, please share with us and post images that you have of your work, if you're willing, so we can engage with what you've done and let that fold in to all the work that we're trying to do. That would be just wonderful.
It was actually an essay in a recent issue of Parry.
Oh, good. Okay, so maybe we can just transfer, or maybe you could just freshly load up some images and some fresh commentary, any or both. That would be fantastic.
Would love to. Thank you so much.
The question of consciousness, I would just leave that at one simple point, which my understanding is that in a Bohmian universe, it is in some way permeated with consciousness. It's a big, huge, nuanced topic that doesn't lend itself to simple things, but I think that would be one way to begin. So thank you, Pam. One more comment, and then we're going to quickly move through our last segment.
Yes, if you can make it a brief one, we have Hugh.
Hello, Hugh.
You're muted.
Unmute myself.
Is
that it? Okay. Have I done it?
Yes.
All right. And that was wonderful. I think the more personal the references became, the more excited I became at there being no differentiation between those, between the broadest reference and the most personal reference. I have a line in front of me: we're internally related to everything. Consciousness is an internal relation to the whole. I'm sure one of you will be able to identify where that comes from of David's, but that's one answer, one single sentence answer to consciousness and the universe. The one thing I wanted to bring to all of your attention, if you were interested in the reference to Rupert Sheldrake, is that Rupert was 80 yesterday, and he had a wonderful party in St. Paul's Cathedral, and there were nearly 400 people there, and I was one of them. And there was a recording made of all the presentations that were made on a wide range of subjects. And I have no doubt I could secure a copy of the recording for anybody who wanted me to go out of my way to get it to them. I think the simplest thing I could do is make it available to Eleanor. Would that be right? And then any interest you have individually for a copy of all of those presentations, if I can sneak one out, is you just let Eleanor know rather than run it past me.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you. So we have one last segment that we want to go through here. We're going to do it rather quickly, but just to bring us to a close here, let's see if I can get back into, let's see, Eva, how do I do this? I've lost something here.
Click on it. Go back.
Okay, so what we've done over the past 2 years, a group of people, we're at around 26 or 30 now. We've worked with a program called Entering Bohm's Holoflux. And this is by and large a process of exercising our imaginations along the lines of David Bohm. So I'll just say a couple of words about that and then invite Beth and Richard, both of whom have been in that program from the start, to offer a couple of comments. The basis of Entering Bohm's Holoflux, which the proposal is that we can do that. We're not just abstractly in it, but we can consciously enter into what he meant by holoflux. The basis that we use is this, what we call the inner body. There's a term called interoception, which means a sensitivity to the insides of your body. And so that's the basis, that we sensitize that inner body. And through that inner body, we then become aware of, for example, clouds. So the movements in the inner body reach out and attend to the movements in the so-called external world. That's the core of what we call rheosoma, which means the flowing body. So I think you can see that this is an experiment writ large of imagination in the key of Bohm, and feeling our way, sensing our way into how the movements of our bodies and our consciousness interact and participate with the movements of the living world. And what many of us has found is that once we send out that sensitivity, it becomes this two-way circuit, that living world speaks back and permeates us as well. And the same thing, you find these flowing qualities in so many different parts of the world. You can find it in tiny little acorns, you find it in mountains, you find it in clouds and water. It's really endless. The experiments that can be run with rheosoma and using that as a way to deepen a connection, a human connection in a conscious way with Bohm's holoflux. Okay, so I'm going to call on Beth to share just a little bit from Beth and a little bit from Richard about your experiences with holoflux and rheosoma, and then we'll be done for today.
Well, I'd like to share one of my very early experiments and experiences. One time I was sitting out on my front porch. This is early in our working together. It was just about spring. Just at the cusp between winter and spring. And so my sense was that things were going to start budding, but it wasn't just quite there yet. But I was sitting on my front porch. It was not quite dawn. It was beginning to get light. As I sat there just waiting, I was feeling very expectant, but I didn't know what I was expectant for. You know, kind of that feeling you get if you wake up in the night and you've heard a noise and all of your attention's really glued to something. I wasn't anxious, but there was that sense of expectancy. The only thing I could notice was there was a little bit of a sense of movement in my feet. It's kind of like warmth, not quite, but it felt like this movement, which is very subtle, keep straight up my body. And when it got up to my head, it kind of went like this. So there was this recurring, very, very subtle. Well, as I was attending to that, my eyes fell on a clump of crepe myrtle trees that were maybe 20 feet in front of me. If you don't know crepe myrtles, they're very thin trunks, absolutely bald, no leaves or anything. Go straight up for maybe 7-8 feet, and then there's a flow of branches, almost like willows, but a little bit thicker, that flow all the way out. And in the summertime, those branches get real poofy flowers. But these crepe myrtles had this shape like this. And I'm sitting there noticing, I had this feeling flowing through me like this. And then I'm looking at the crepe myrtle that has that same shape. So I let that feeling just grow a little bit. And I had this sense that I was really touching into the crepe myrtle's energy pattern. And given that it was just spring, there was a lot more energy in the crepe myrtle than I was feeling, because it was trying to push the energy out to regrow the leaves that were put out the flowers. So it was quite energetic. I thought that's really wild. And I like, either I'm touching into the same pattern of the crepe myrtle, or I'm touching into it. So that really perplexed me. And I tried a few more times over a period about other life forms around me. I wonder if they also have a signature energy pattern. Now, not always could I tap into it, but I did find pine trees are quite different in their energy pattern than our crepe myrtle. There was an almost dead bush that barely had any life. It had this pounding like this. The last cells, it had been frozen during the frost a few weeks earlier. A few cells that were determined that they were going to put out. So I don't know. I'm just perplexed by having been able to tap into these various life forms around me that kind of like a little symphony around me. So that's one of my very early experiences, and a lot of other ones. So Richard, I know you've had some as well. So how about you?
Well, for me, I found one very particular entry point into the experience of rheosoma. And it was surprising to me because it occurred while I was driving down the road. And it had to do with trees in motion due to a moderate wind, maybe 15 miles an hour. And I just suddenly apprehended the trees in relationship to the wind as all the leaves were responding. And that discovery became a kind of keystone entry point into playing with the experience of rheosoma, whether it was landforms such as the image Lee showed, or clouds, but looking at the branches and leaves of trees in motion allowed me to consider the larger set of relationships that very particular image generated, whether it was the tree roots in the ground connecting to the mycelium and the soil beneath, or the wind and the generators of wind, which are temperature differentials and related to the appearance of clouds in an indirect way. So it was surprising, and yet it remains an entry point for me to play with the idea of rheosoma and the flows in the universe that can be perceived. And I still use it when I'm in a moment of reverie or consideration of the world around me. And of course, what's surprising to me even now is that I can enjoy it while driving down the road, which seems counterintuitive, actually. I don't.
Thank
Back
you,
to you, Lee.
Richard. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Beth. Someone asked the spelling of rheosoma, RHEOSOMA. And just to be clear on one point, we're not suggesting that what we experiment with rheosoma is anything unique or new. Most of us have had these kinds of experiences all our lives. Rheosoma is always there in one way or another. What we're trying to do is attune to it more fully rather than make up something out of the blue. So that's kind of the underlying idea with rheosoma. So we've gone quite a bit over time. I'm afraid we're going to have to end. I thank you all for showing up and your patience and your queries and your interest in this work that we're doing today. Thank you, Richard and Beth, for being here today. Thank you, James and Eleanor, for making all of this happen. And everyone, once again, thank you for being here. And we continue. We have another one tomorrow.
We should all unmute and say thank you.
Thank you, Lee, anyway, and Beth and Richard for this wonderful session.
Fantastic.
So great. Just a couple of things before we go. As mentioned during this session, we will have a Sutra forum. For those who don't know what that is, it's basically an online forum, which is a great way to share your ideas during the weeks or time between these sessions. You should receive the link to join this weekend. So just follow the link and you'll be part of the conversation. I also wanted to invite you all as well to tomorrow's session, which will be entitled Imagining for Real, where we will have Tim Ingold, Melissa Nelson, Lee Nichol, and Hester Reeve talking about imagination. And in the meantime, if you do have any questions, you can email us.
Thank you so much.
@ParisCenter.com to contact Eleanor, or James at ParisCenter.com to contact me. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you all to all the panelists, and a very great welcome to Lee. And we'll see you again soon here at the Paris Center.